All right. Hello, students. Hello, everyone. Last week, students tended not to have their cameras on. I think it's a little nicer, a little more gezellig for the speakers if we can see people and get the feeling that we're interacting. So please turn your cameras on. I will wait another minute here before going into introductions and so on. I'm going to ask students again, as I did last week, to prepare. We'll have the two speakers' presentations one after the other, and then we'll have a question and answer session. And I would like each student to pose a question to one of the speakers. So please, please do that. Please take notes. I think we still have a few people joining us. Yeah, it's nice to see people's faces. And I'm going to begin. I was about to give our two speakers, before I introduce them, a quick summary of the four talks that we had earlier in the program, but it just occurred to me that I should ask the students to do that. So I wondered if any student, Dutch or American, we'll start with, the first presentation was mine, if you recall. Would someone just give a quick summary of a couple of sentences? Tell them what was the first presentation about? Can someone step up and do that? Who will be bold? I'm sure it was terribly memorable, so that someone can do that.
I see a hand.
Oh, there's hands. I don't see hands.
Sophia.
Okay.
Yes, I can try. Please correct me if it's wrong, but I think it was mainly about the cultural differences between the Netherlands and the United States, and how the Dutch system is more like a collective system, and the system in the United States is more an individualist system.
I think that's a pretty good quick summary of it. Thank you for that. The next presentation, the second presentation on the first day, was from Henk Ovink, whom I'm sure Guillermo and Hans both know. Would someone like to give a quick summary of what Henk told us? And I can't see the hands up for some reason. So just go ahead, someone, and start talking. Someone can do it. Jack, how about you?
Okay, sure. So the second talk from Ambassador Ovink just focused on kind of his role in water, and talking about how water has a trickle-down effect through all UN Sustainable Development Goals, and how we should focus on kind of tackling water planning and water infrastructure through a collaborative approach involving the community and such and so forth in a more comprehensive way, and just kind of talking about how that can be applied to the United States.
Good, very clear. Then one of the things that Henk Ovink, one of the many things he has done in the past decade, is he brought or attempted to bring Dutch thinking to New York post-Hurricane Sandy. And so the next class, the two speakers we were talking about, the Rebuild by Design program and other efforts in New York in the past decade. Can someone give us a quick overview of Amy Chester and what she talked about with Rebuild by Design? How about Katrina? Would you like to tackle that?
So for me, I think the main takeaway was how she talked about to involve the communities and how to have a broader design approach to the whole water management problem, and to actually include people in designing, for example, also with jobs in recreational areas and things like that.
Yeah, good. Anybody else have anything to add about Amy's presentation? All right, and then we heard from Edgar Westerhoff from Arcadis in New York City. Would someone like to summarize what he had to say? Hannah, how about you? Would you like to take a crack at that? If you're speaking with your mute on, then we can't hear you. Tracy, how about you? Oh, it wasn't you, Hunter. I asked Hannah. Go ahead, Tracy.
Okay, basically the second speaker talked sort of more about like the actual design portion, so showing sustainable designs for buildings and how to integrate sort of previous projects from the Netherlands and the United States.
Okay, that's good. And yeah, and one of the things I took from both of them was that you know, the U.S. has historically, its institutions, its municipalities are very siloed. So every department is only responsible for its specifically what it does. And when dealing with a problem like water, dealing with flooding, becoming more resilient, you know, the Parks Department is only concerned about the park. The Transportation Department is only going to come in and pave the road and then go away. So what has transpired in New York over the last 10 years is building connections and building a network so that these entities can talk to each other and recognize that they each have a stake in this in the wider concern, because it's something that affects everyone. Does anybody have any questions about any of that? I mean, of course, we all have questions, but any procedural things, anything that you're confused on before we move into today's presentations? And again, just speak up, because for some reason I'm not seeing hands go up. Okay, in that case, and once again, in case you missed me saying it, I would appreciate it if you would turn your camera on so that the speakers have a sense of an audience before them. And Hans and Guillermo, do you have a preference who speaks first? Hans will go first, I think.
Yeah, we agree. I have most of the slides, so
Okay.
so,
okay,
so,
then
Guillermo is easy.
Yeah, but well, by way of
mine is smaller, so you
okay.
know.
All right. Well, by way of a brief introduction, Hans Pietersen is Senior Advisor for International Affairs at Rijkswaterstaat, where he is in charge of coordinating neighboring countries, Germany, Belgium, France, the UK, as well as the European Commission and the US. And especially for the American students, Rijkswaterstaat is the implementing organization of the Dutch Ministry of Infrastructure and Water Management. It manages and develops the national highways and waterways. And this is from the website. Together with others, we are working on a country that is protected against flooding, where there is sufficient greenery and sufficient and clean water, and where you can get from A to B quickly and safely. That's Rijkswaterstaat's statement of its mission. Hans, please give us your presentation.
Right. I'll start sharing my screen. See if that works. So I should share my screen now.
Yeah,
I can see it shared.
Yes.
I can see my screen, but I don't see if you can see. So if it's all okay, then I'll just start presenting. Is that okay?
We can see it. Yes.
You can see it. All right. So well, I was introduced. Indeed, I coordinate international affairs together with a big team, actually. So it's all about people in the end. I work in a unit dealing with knowledge and innovation management, and that's very interesting because we don't have to be very much concerned with what happens today or tomorrow, but what will happen in 5 to 50 or maybe even 100 years. So we are really very much forward-looking. So that's a very nice. I mean, that's the best position you can actually have, probably. Just for the students, by training I'm a geologist, actually a geochemist, and later I did a PhD in civil materials engineering. So I'm a civilized geologist, and yeah, you can call it fate, or it came on my path, or luck, or coincidence that I ended up after a brief 2.5 year stay at the European Commission in a unit actually dealing with international affairs, and then especially with water. So I started my career on sand and gravel and all kinds of raw materials, and ended up with water. But for geologists, that doesn't really make a difference. So with that said, the title I was voluntold, we call it, was Managing Institutional Cultural Change: How Systems Adapt to Broadening Demands of Water Resilience. I always feel that to get a proper understanding of that, especially somebody from me talking from about another country where you might never have been, never heard about, I'll start with a little bit of history. Hope this works, because I have to. I think it's frozen. That's always a nice thing about sharing. Let me check. Share again. Right.
And
right.
Russell, while Hans is on,
you can see this.
Yes.
Yeah, you can see it. And
Yeah,
do you see the full screen, or do you see a part of a screen?
We see the full screen, but it's reduced in size. But it's very viewable though.
Okay. Well, then I'll just continue, because apparently I had the wrong knob. So if all is well, you see now a slide with content, right?
That's right.
Yeah. Okay. So this is the build-up of my my presentation. A little bit of the geography. You're a geologist, so you're not. A bit of the history of water management. I was asked to focus on the 90s, so that's what I'll start with. Sort of the end of the first Delta program, then I'll focus on the second Delta program, and end with I would say the way we manage the future and the way we cooperate with our stakeholders. Because I feel that sort of cultural change that also has to deal with as a government organization, how you stand with sort of 2 feet in society and how that changed over time. So that's a bit of the storyline. So this is our country. It's a delta. It's very flood sensitive. That doesn't mean that we have frequent floods. It's I would say far less than in the United States so far, but 26% of our country is below sea level. So we need dikes and dunes to protect that. And the other 29% is susceptible to river flooding. So if we wouldn't have had levees along our main rivers, it would flood. So there is an interest there to keep our country safe and manage the risks. This is, if you zoom out a little bit, it's our country together with a part of the northern German, Belgium, Danish, and also a coast of the eastern part of the United Kingdom, England. All the red zone is, I would say, flood sensitive. If there was no protection. So if there was no protection, that these are the parts which would or could flood frequently. And just to have a comparison, well, this is on the left-hand side, you see a nice map of the state of Mississippi with New Orleans. So the Mississippi River, and if you compare that delta with our delta, you could sort of recognize some similarities. That's always the thing with deltas. That's where worldwide, I think 70% of the population lives in delta areas, because you have easy access to the sea. You can trade. There's usually very fertile ground. So agriculture is a big thing, and that's where people live. And the downside is that's where all the water from the backcountry ends, where you're close to sea, so you're susceptible to storms. So there is every reason to protect yourself. And this is the watershed, sort of the mainly the River Rhine and the River Meuse. The River Rhine arrives through Germany, and the River Meuse through France and Belgium. And I just put there some, it's in cubic meters per second, but the peak discharges, highest recorded 12,000 cubic meters per second. That doesn't tell you that much, but our highest recorded discharge is sort of close to the very lowest discharge of the Mississippi, or maybe even half of that. So compared to the US, it's just a small river. The big thing about it actually is that if you look at the number of inhabitants sort of living in the countries and also the Netherlands where this river flows through, there's several million of them. Actually, there are much more people living in the watershed of the River Rhine than live close to in the watershed of the sort of close to the border of the watershed of the Mississippi. So if you talk about risks to the population, this is a very high risk country. So going back, I've seen the presentation of Henk Ovink. He went a bit back to the early days. And the early days in the Netherlands was when there was this sense some 800 years, 900 years ago, that due to frequent flooding, the people recognized the need to protect their land. So they needed to manage the risks. So you could say even at that time, because why did you want like to manage the risk? Because you didn't want to die from a flood, but you also didn't want that your valuable agricultural land was flooded, which could damage your crop, your yield. So actually, even in these times, the revenue or to manage the risks, so the risk to human life, but also the financial risk was a big driver. And that led somewhere around 1300 to the first, what we now call regional water authorities, or water boards. That's more the Dutch translation. And essentially what they started to work is make small levees and irrigate and drain through channels the water from our agricultural lands. And somewhere around 1500, we started to use windmills as pumps. These are these famous lineups of windmills that you can still see, a World Heritage Site. And we have some sparsely documented records of floodings in the past. This is one of the big ones. These times you didn't have proper weather predictions, so people were usually caught by surprise by a flood. Lots of damage, etc. And that's still up to, I would say, present time. And that is the same for the Netherlands. It's the same for the US. That we learn from the extreme weather events, if you could call it that way, and what the way it affects our infrastructure and our livelihoods, and that sort of makes us aware. Okay, yes, we have to change. I guess both in the United States as well as the Netherlands, we try to become a little bit more proactive. The Netherlands being a relatively small country, also a relatively rich country for a small country. We are probably slightly better prepared compared to the complete US to be a little bit more proactive. But yeah, the other side is that the kind of extreme weather events, what we in our country experience are, sometimes you could say minute compared to the big hurricanes or tornadoes or forest fires you encounter in the United States. So it's not completely fair to completely compare that. And this is just a little animation of how our country changed over, say, last 1,000 years. So what you essentially see is that we reclaimed lands from the sea or from our rivers. That has been ongoing since the 1300s. And the driver was reducing risks, but also to make sure that we have sufficient land for agriculture or other uses. So I guess Henk Oving already mentioned that there is this famous saying that God created the world, but the Dutch created the Netherlands. But this, I think this animation shows it all. This is what we did to create the Netherlands. But yeah, the downside of all these levees and dunes and systems and polders we have is that we have to pump. And the downside of that, especially because the southern part of the western part, or you could say the northwestern part of our country, you have a subsurface of clay and peat, either riverine clay or clay a bit more salty from reclaimed sea areas, seabed areas. And that has the tendency to, I would say, become a little bit more compact if you pump water out or extract groundwater. In the past, that was not really managed well. We still don't do a very proper job, but we do a proper job in the sense that, yes, our country is dry in the western part, but the downside is that we also have quite a lot of soil subsidence. And actually, the speed in which our soil subsides in the western part is much higher than the predictions of sea level rise. So you could also say that combined, the two, soil subsidence and sea level rise, are the perfect storm. And actually the dark blue area, what you see in the northeastern part of our country, that's due to the extraction of natural gas. There's a big debate in our country. The aim is to stop extracting this natural gas, mainly because it's not only soil subsidence, but it's also earthquakes. And I would say that the people in that part of our country over the last sort of 10 years became quite vocal in the sense that they wanted this to stop. So that is an example of, I would say, cultural awareness, cultural change. But people said, yeah, but you're extracting this natural gas, but at the expense of lots of earthquakes would damage our properties. Just please stop it, because we don't have we only see the downside of it, but we don't get a fair share of the revenues. So it already illustrates probably the case of cultural change. And this is just a graphic. So yeah, we managed to reclaim land from either rivers or the sea by making ditches, by making dikes, by using pumps, first windmills, later steam engines in the mid 1800s, and nowadays all electrical powered. But you see that comes at the expense of soil subsidence. And then, yeah, you have sea level rise. So again, probably the perfect storm for the future. How to deal with that? Yeah, then a very quick one on Rijkswaterstaat itself, but it was already set in the introduction. But I think it's very fair to say that if you, I sort of condensed our mission a little bit, but over the last 5 years, quite explicitly, we put in our mission that whatever we do it with others. So, and we provide timely and the best possible risk-based information to our stakeholders and network users. So, and that is really something which, yeah, we didn't have 10 years ago. This is something we started to put in our mission only the last 10 years. So again, as a big organization, we are almost, I think, well, of the same age as the Army Corps of Engineers. So both organizations are slightly over 200 years old, but we have to in order to to remain relevant for in the end the politics and the public, we have to change ourselves. So we have to work with others, and that's, I think, illustrates a bit of the case. So this is what we manage. We manage highways, we manage waterways, and we manage the main water system, including parts of the North Sea, and everything which is not main, the smaller roads and the smaller waterways and the smaller canals. That's usually managed by either provinces or the regional water authorities. So but we have to do it together. But this is what the Rijkswaterstaat does. And these are just some data. So quite a lot of dunes. Actually, not so much levees in dams. It's just slightly over 300 kilometers of the almost 20,000 kilometers in total. So that's most of the levees are managed by regional water authorities. But we have an oversight, and we also manage storm surge barriers. So this is a bit what we do now. And this is our main waterways network. Again, main rivers, the main shipping routes in the Dutch part of the continental shelf of the North Sea, Lake IJsselmeer in the northern, this sort of Waddenzee, we call it, in the northern part. So that's what we manage. But quite a lot of locks and quite a lot of bridges and lots of waterways. And that's, you would say, well, just a small country, but the big number of locks and waterways and storm surge barriers makes it interesting as a relatively small country to work with a relatively big country and a big organization like the Army Corps of Engineers, because there are not so many countries in the world which have to manage so much hydraulic infrastructure like locks. So that is one of the big drivers also in the past of our cooperation. So again, to this political agenda. So just very briefly, we had some big floods in 1916 in the north, when going back to this, well, I can't point, but there is a barrier dam somewhere in the middle upper part of our country. You see that there is this Waddenzee, which is light blue, and then there is a little bit darker blue area that used to be an open part of connected to the sea. But because of that flood in 1916, we built a barrier dam there in 1932 and created a Lake IJsselmeer. So we made a freshwater lake out of a sea arm, which was part of our delta and was salt water. And then again, in 1953, we had a big flood disaster in the southwest, and that led to the first delta works. So these were, I would say, big, you could say, extreme weather events, which led to an action, building a big barrier dam or building storm surge barriers. And this is just a picture of 1953. All this shaded area was flooded, so it was really a big incident. And you have to realize in 1953, people didn't have mobile phones. There was no internet. Communication was very sparse. And of course, that's probably everywhere where you have a big disaster. It never comes alone. So this storm hit us a bit by surprise. The weather prediction was not as perfect as we have now. It was also in the middle of the night. So yeah, that's usually with, I think, Murphy's Law. It's always a sort of an overlap of all kinds of little incidents which make it a big disaster. So the first Delta program, what we did is installed a government committee at that time. And the structural solution was to shorten the Dutch coastline with dams and barriers. And that looks a bit, schematically, if you now go to the south. So if you look at the map, everything which is, I would sort of a slightly darker blue, that's salt water, and everything which is a little bit lighter is now fresh water. And you can see that there are lots of dams there, which either if they are really marking the change between the salt water and fresh water, they're usually closed or almost closed structures, while if it remains the same color of blue, then they are open or semi-open structures. And I think it's interesting to see that the original plan, Rijkswaterstaat at that time, so we're talking about the late 1960s, which was prepared to close off this entire delta with big dams. And the main reason was actually financial, because as you can imagine, by just having a few dams at the outer side of this delta meant we had far less dams or levees to repair. So it was actually also a financial solution, because otherwise we had to go all around these little tiny islands and make sure that the levees were there on a higher, better level and higher. But it also led to, I would say, the start of what you could now call environmental advocacy groups. At that time, quite simple, local population, fishermen. And on this little photo, you see a barge with a statement written on it, and it's in Dutch. But it essentially, if I translate it, it's Rijkswaterstaat, recognize your mistake and keep this Oosterschelde is called that sea arm, keep it salt. So Rijkswaterstaat, due to this, I would say, community uprisal locally, Rijkswaterstaat changed its plans, and instead of making or constructing a solid dam, we now made one of the first storm surge barriers, sort of a semi-open or an open construction, what we can close down in the event of a high level of seawater due to storms. So, but that, the interesting thing is that it was the local population which pushed our organization to come forward with a different solution there. And then, I was asked to start with the 90s, so I just fast forward to the 90s. We had two, you could say, we call it a flood, but it was not actually a flood, but it was sort of an almost flood. You can see in the top photo that the water in the river is almost on the crest of the levee, and actually the water level is much higher than the farms on the other side of the levee. So which led to, I would say, quite a lot of local situations where the levee actually more or less floated on the water. It hardly could keep the water out. There were some smaller communities which were flooded. Of course, you have cities close to the river where the boulevards flooded. So it was you could say, a narrow escape. But then there's this saying, never waste a good crisis. So actually these floods led, first of all, to an emergency program to reinforce the levees. But then, the idea was also, okay, if this is the kind of water level we have to manage, and actually maybe more, we can't continue just making our levees higher. We also have to work and to look for different solutions. So that was the sort of the idea there. And that's probably of interest because we had these floods, and then it's a link to 2005 New Orleans. You had Hurricane Katrina, which flooded a major part of New Orleans. It had a striking similarity in a sense to what happened in 1953 with the Netherlands. So in both cases, almost 1,800 people, or slightly over 1,800 people, were unfortunately killed or drowned by the flood. And you had a film which you might have heard about or may not, but Al Gore, your former vice president, he made a film which was called The Inconvenient Truth. And I think, why was that important? Because of his statue being a American vice president, he made a film which succeeded. I would say maybe not so much in America, but it succeeded in Europe to create awareness of climate change. Scientists already knew, hey, there's something happening. We didn't have all the data. but he created the political awareness. And that's very important, because without political awareness, you won't have the interest and you won't have the funding, and you can, as engineers, like an organization like Rijkswaterstaat, you can do whatever, but you won't succeed in getting all the funding for the projects you need. So together, so this sort of narrow escape we had in the Netherlands, a big disaster in New Orleans, a film which confronted us with the inconvenient truth about climate change, that led to the understanding that in our country, we had to move, well, we had to do something to be more proactive instead of being surprised by extreme weather events. So we needed to, what at that time was called engineered spatial solutions. So it's all about managing the water. And what we did, we installed a high-level Delta Commission. So high level of experts sit in a sort of the famous room together and make a report. So that's what they did between 2006, 2008. And they came forward with a proposal for a second Delta program. And I think I'd like to repeat the statement that the threat is not acute, but measures to improve flood risk management and fresh water supply should be prepared urgently. So this was really, I think, the first time we explicitly stated to essentially the public, but also to politics, you have to do something, you have to make a plan. So that happened. So after this Delta committee, we created the second Delta program. And there are, well, we call it the 5Ds. So what we at that time we thought was very wise. Yeah, we installed a high-level commissioner, what we call a Delta commissioner. And we did that to become a bit more independent of politics. So the idea is you have a Delta commissioner with a mandate for 7 years, while we have elections every 4 years. So this Delta commissioner should be a bit immune to all kinds of political changes, but should have the, I would say, the power and the statute to address ministers directly with either an advice asked for or an advice he feels himself he should give to the ministers. Now, well, just the Delta commissioner is nothing. So you also need to have what we call something enshrined in law. So we also created a Delta Act together with the Delta Fund, because a law without funding is also nothing. So you have a law and you have funding for that. And since 2014, we publish annual Delta decisions. So and that's something we send to Parliament. So it's sort of the similarity to your Congress in the US, to keep track and also give evidence to what we did and what is needed for the next the few years. And it's also important that by that time we all were very much aware that you have to take others aboard if you do that. It's not anymore top down like what we came away with in the earlier parts of the 20th century up to say the 1970s, early 1990s. So ministry is responsible for policy guidelines. Rijkswaterstaat, we manage the national water system. We have provinces responsible for spatial planning and supervision on municipality and water boards. You have the municipalities, they're responsible for the local spatial planning, for the sewage and drainage systems, and you have the regional water authorities, they for the regional water system, water quality, water quantity, and sewage water treatment. So this is how it's organized in our country, but we understand we have to work together. So this whole second Delta program, we had 3 national programs, one based on safety, so the risk-based standards based on a cost-benefit analysis. We have a fresh water strategy because we don't have a lack of water, but if you look at the more extreme climate change scenarios, we might have more extremes in water supply from, we're depending on mainly on whatever falls in as rain in our country and what we get from the rivers. And we have to adapt spatially, sort of the best practice there. And we had 6 regional programs because our country is, although it's tiny, it's quite diverse. So we have a coastal area, we have a special area in the north, we call the Waddenzee. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. We have the Lake IJsselmeer with its specific challenges. We have the rivers with its specific challenges. And then we have a very, I would say, sensitive area in the southwestern part. This is the Delta, where you have both, I would say, a challenge from the sea, a storm, and also from high river discharges. So the worst thing what can happen is that they both coincide at the same time. So you have a coastal flood with high water, and you have a big river discharge. So these areas need special attention. So the whole concept there is to have what we call a regional inclusive approach. So regional steering committees involve, make sure that you take into account local characteristic, local knowledge, local ideas, create trust and acceptance, and combine wherever possible with local development agenda. So don't come in, hey, we are going to make a new waterfront, but also listen to what the city council wants. Maybe they want something else there too. So maybe you are able to combine these projects, and be very open to innovative approaches. So that's a bit of the way we like to do that. With, again, the Delta Commission is there for the supervision of the whole process. And this little cartoon, well, if you talk with other people, everybody wants something different. That's the illustration. So the big thing is to make sure that everybody has a say, but in the end, don't become stalled that nothing happens. And this is just an idea about, well, depending on the climate change scenarios, we might encounter higher peak discharges of our river in winter and much lower ones in summer. These are, I think, a bit of the challenges we have. And the high discharge, of course, that's a flooding risk, and the low discharge, that's a freshwater supply, but also, I would say, a navigation issue, because there's quite a lot of barge traffic from the Netherlands to Germany over the River Rhine. So these are the challenges. So this second Delta program, comprehensive program, flood protection, freshwater, 1.4 billion euros a year. So that's, I would say, roughly 1.5 billion dollars a year with the Delta Fund. Roughly 50% for new investments and 50% for maintenance and operation. Focusing on flood protection standards, freshwater supply, spatial adaptation, regional strategies. Quite important. What we asked every community and also for Rijkswaterstaat to carry out climate stress tests, both for, say, at community level, but also at infrastructure. And it's quite important because we're a small country. We get our water from lots of other countries through our rivers. So international cooperation is very important. So all these sort of the diversity of it could mean, depending on the part of the country you're looking at, that you look at different kinds of solutions. But key to it is our safety standards. And I just zoom in a little bit. It's all risk-based. So this is what we had in the past. We had large differences. We had climate change. We had quite a number of residents with, where people live, you build, you create economic value. We understand much more of what we are able to do, but also what we should avoid. And that's why we made new arrangements. So very quickly, the idea is that we provide protection. So by law, the task of the Dutch government is to ensure that, well, not now, but as soon as we can, we provide safety to all inhabitants. And that's a bit based on the fact that an average citizen in the Netherlands should have a chance of 1 in 100,000 to die because of a flood. Now that's quite a, you say, why did you pick that specific number? But the reason is this: 1 in 100,000 is usually also applied in, for instance, if you take an airplane, the design is also, you can never build something which is 100% foolproof. So, but the design, it's a typical airplane has backup systems and maybe backup systems for backup systems. So the industry standard there is also 1 in 100,000. It's same for a big industry. You'd like to minimize risk, minimize the chance that people get killed. So that's one part. So protection, make sure that that we have well, a societal acceptable number of people who could probably potentially die because of flooding. And the other one is to reduce or protect our economic value. So so manage the risk. And it depends a little bit where you live in our country. So the current situation is that the high risk areas are really somewhere in our the area where we have the main rivers, and then the western part, of course, because it's partly below sea level, that's a slightly higher risk. So that's the situation we have more or less now. And what we intend to, where we like to move to, is the situation which is depicted on the right picture. Well, so in 30 years time, we'd like to make sure that we are able to reduce this or manage these risks much better. So risk management is key to the way we manage floods and create our flood safety in the Netherlands. But of course, the reality is also that urban expansion, so increasingly less space for river and its floodplains. These are two pictures. One is 1830, the other one is 2000, and you see just the vast expanse, like you see everywhere in the world, of urban expansion, and that reduces the room you have for a river. So how to provide more room? Well, that's not, I would say it's not rocket science. It's something which after the 1927 floods in the Mississippi was also applied in the US. But you can lower your floodplains, you can deepen your summer beds, you can relocate your dike, make side channels, remove obstacles, well, lots of measures, create side channels. So essentially, what we did in a big program, we call it Roof to the River, actually. But it was a bit mirroring what the Army Corps did over since 1930 along in major parts of the floodplain of the Mississippi. So it's not rocket science, but you have to do it. And I think the big challenge we had in our country, because there was this sense of urgency. So the challenge was to carry this program out in just a few years, maybe. Well, you see it here. Actually, the real project started in 2007, but before there was a shovel in the ground, it was 2010, 2011, and we had to finish preferably 2015, in practice 2018. We still have some little loose ends, but it's almost finished. That was the big challenge, to carry that out at the same time involving all kinds of stakeholders. So the key are probably a national program, national funding, national flood safety boundary conditions. So we knew, okay, whatever we do, we have to do this with these standards in mind. We have to meet these standards, these safety standards, but leave the implementation to the local or regional authorities and the communities, because they know best. So we set the conditions and they carried it out. So this whole project consists of, I think, 35 or something like that projects all along our rivers, just to take away the bottlenecks in and to ensure that we have a better flow of sort of the peak discharge river water to the sea. So the big challenge really was to do this sort of all together, because as you can imagine that this only works. You cannot do just one project, because they all interact. So you have to carry it out all together. And I think there is a bit of a difference if you look at the Mississippi. Well, you can't compare it completely, but there, I think 90% of all the works along the Mississippi planned for in the 1930s are now carried out by the Army Corps, mainly due to a lack of funding. So there is the funding was not upfront; it was just project by project. But yeah, at the same time, in the whole sort of delta area in the Mississippi, compared to the Netherlands, there are less people which are really flood prone. So you had the luxury of that you had a little bit more time. We didn't have that. And just as an example, this is something we recreated in a part. So you can imagine that it used to be a delta somewhere until the 1800s, early 1900s. Then it was made agricultural land with all these polders. And now we said, okay, yeah, but that doesn't really help us with a big peak discharge of water. So we'd like to have it all. So yeah, what we do need is a bypass, so that with high discharges, river can flow through the land. So the best thing is to convert that to nature, back as it was 150 years ago. We still have some areas where agricultural activities can remain. We like to have more tourism, biking, hiking, canoeing, boating, etc. A new museum. And there are sufficient areas where you can, so these are the sort of in-between areas where you can both have, for instance, cattle breeding and nature development. So when there's low water, there's cattle there. And when there's a high flow of water, you take the cattle in and the water can flow through. So that's a bit, that was the concept. That's just one of these Room for the River projects. So daily situation and say one in, well, 100 days a year, it could be flooded, and one in, say, probably 1,000, 2,000 years, it is completely flooded. That's a bit of the idea. But to, I'd say, move a little bit up and down with the peak discharges of the river. So that means actually a lot of earth moving. So new farms on elevated earth mounds, new bridges, because you'd like to be able to move there. But we also reduced the levee, so to let water in. We also experimented with what we call hybrid dike forest solutions. So you can make a dike or a levee less high but you have to, if you keep to the standards, you can imagine that a part of it's just high water and the other part is the offset because of wave action. Now, this offset of wave action, you can compensate that by, for instance, creating a little forest in front of the levee. So that's some of the things which happened. I think this is just the idea. You have a willow forest, and every 3 years you mow it down and it will grow again. But in the meantime, you can imagine if in a flood situation with a storm water offset, these willow trees dampen the effect of waves to the actual levee. So these are examples of how you can, with sort of local ingenuity, nice ideas based on, I would say, sound concepts, which are scientifically, I would say, approved and tested. You can come to different kind of solutions which have the same effects. So the key for success is really feasible solutions. Again, so you have the practical operational experience of Rijkswaterstaat, regional water authorities. You work with evidence-based standards and rules. Make sure that it's not something there in a little paper, but there is room for action. So it's embedded in law. And you involve your stakeholders in a very, I would say, effective way. We call it strategic stakeholder management. So that's a bit what we try to do. So it's innovation, co-creation with governments, with our knowledge institute, with the private sector, and also with local stakeholder involvement. So just, well, I'll skip this one just because of the time. But this strategic stakeholder management actually, it's based on a mutual gains principles. And actually that's a US principle, but we applied it as a government. It's a proactive approach. And essentially it focuses on that if you'd like to take action somewhere as a government, it's essential that you have an open attitude, that you base that on whatever you do that you acquire correct information, and that you try to achieve support. So what you intend to do is bring stakeholders together, build a real meaningful relationship with them, and work on supported solutions. And that may not be what you had originally in mind. I think that's I think a big lesson there. So keep an open mind. But what helps us a lot is that, yeah, we in the underline, there is a legal requirement that we have to provide safety to our inhabitants. So it's not you're not completely free to do whatever you want. It has to be evidence-based. But how it could look like, that's much more open. So I would say, yeah, maybe traditional stakeholder management is really telling stakeholders what is about to change. You also say that's based on what they called decide, announce, and defend, and then so that's that, and they usually add abandon. So decide as government, announce what you want to do, defend because lots of people won't agree, and then in the end you may have nothing because there is so much process that you have to change your plan anyway. So it will just take longer. So that's typically the current way we try to get our projects developed. And this is, I mean, how it could look like. It's I would say you have to manage it. So on the one axis, you see all the stakeholders. Then you see all the issues, which could be anything. And then there's an interest. So all the colors divide, okay, red is a high interest, orange a middle interest, yellow is a low interest. And in the end, you get something, okay, what should you do? So in the very right column, you have something, okay, this is something we have to communicate. We have to communicate. This is for something for participation. These people, we just have to inform them. But in that way, you can really manage your stakeholders. So by assessing what they want, but take it in and make sure that you really take that into account, so that the people with an interest in the project actually see that whatever they put forward was taken seriously and, yeah, if possible, implemented. This takes more time, but it takes more time in the beginning of your project, but the result will that you actually have a project which is not frustrated by all kinds of legal issues. So this is a bit about, yeah, I think you can read it. I'll make sure that you get the slides, but this is really, it's really about dialogue. It's really about eliminating misunderstandings. It's also make sure that that you structure it well, that you be clear, that you be unambiguous, that you are reliable as a government, that you work on trust, not fake trust, but real trust. So this is, I think, yeah, this seems to work. Now this is working principle. I'm not going to explain it, but there's something to chew on a little bit later, I would say. And yeah, that you may encounter in literature also what is called the engagement ladder. So if you look at the amount of involvement for a project and the impact, so it starts usually with informing people, then it starts with communicating about what you want. Slightly higher up in this ladder is involve, but a bit ad hoc. Then okay, we'd like to have what we call participation. So you have your say, but yeah, we listen, but you may not be really heard. And then you move forward to consensus. That's a bit where we try to be now, between participating consensus. Yeah, eventually you'd like to be, well, that would be the ultimate dream, to empowerment. That's maybe more a theory than a reality, but but this is the engagement ladder. So that we'd like to, our intention is really to move up on this participation ladder if we carry out our projects. So and these are just some examples where we apply these principles. So the left hand figure is part of this river Waal. We call it there the Waal. There was a bend in the river close to a town where, you can imagine that if there's a high flow of water, especially through the bend, you get a sort of very high water levels there. So we created a bypass, but we also made sure that there was a possibility for the city of Nijmegen to integrate that into their own city. The other photo is of this situation where we lowered the levee, so where an area could flood partially if we had high water discharges. So we call it a nature-based hybrid solution. Another example is a stretch of the coastline where we had a very poor performing levee. So the city there was quite flood prone. So we recreated the coastline there, adding a lot of sand, making sure that we had a nice coastline, because you can imagine that if you can either build a high dike, but you can also create a wide dune, which may be a little bit lower. You still fulfill you are able to meet the safety criteria in the same way. So that's what we did there, and then sort of matching local projects. The city itself wanted to get rid of all the cars on the boulevard, so in part of the project there is a sort of underground parking garage. So but it was all done by one contractor. So I would say the nuisance disturbance for the local community was just 2.5 years. So that's an example where we combined all these combined projects and make sure that we had local stakeholder interest actually taken into account in the project itself. Another example is actually to exchange best practices. That's what we did over the past 5 years with the Army Corps of Engineers and its Engineering and Research Development Center. So we made a handbook, international handbook on natural and nature-based features, 20 chapter, 180 people who participated there. Lots from Rijkswaterstaat, from the Army Corps, but also from the English Environment Agency, and lots of universities and other organizations, both profit and non-profit, which ended up in a 1,000-page booklet. But luckily, we have a 150-page summary there too. It reads actually pretty well, I have to say. And there's also a nice chapter about stakeholder engagement in it, which I sort of contributed to. So it's downloadable. So if you're interested, please have a look there. Well, I just skipped this one because of the time. Yeah, this is just the example of the Katwijk case, how it conceptually looked, but also some of the ideas we have for the future. So maybe we can sort of combine these levies with the need to live, actually, build houses, build recreation areas, etc. So it's a bit of the idea. So time for questions, or we just switch to Guillermo so he can present, and then we have a joint session to answer all your questions.
Thank you, Hans. The students have been hearing the past couple of classes about the Dutch approach and this collaborative and bringing stakeholders together. So you have given two things. You've given an overview of that, but you've also given, I think, especially to the American students, an awareness that this Dutch approach, this Dutch model, isn't just a static thing, that it has evolved over the course of from the early 20th century to now. I neglected to bring in my colleague at Groningen, Terry van Dijk, who you, Hans, and Guillermo, you both may know, I'm not sure. But Terry, I just thought I would bring you in, and I don't know if you would like to make a comment based on what Hans has said, or say something by way of transition.
Yeah, thanks for this. And no problem. Yeah, we together organized this session because this exchange between the US and Holland is so explicit, and also sometimes not so explicit. But there's a sort of a connection between these two, and a lot of other countries as well. And for the Dutch students, I've been discussing with them a few times on, hey, how does this work when one country's paradigm is translated into another context? What do you bump into then? And we see here that Rijkswaterstaat has a certain culture, inner culture, and a certain paradigm sitting in an institutional context of certain legislation, also not only pertaining to the water issue, but also in general to how the government interacts with people. And I'm very curious to see from the Army Corps of Engineers how that culture and that embedding in the legislative framework and in the local culture, how that with the same as we heard, the same age and with the same mission, how that gets a totally different form. And then the question, like Hans was saying, how do they learn from each other? What do they learn from each other? Why do they learn from each other? And who exactly learns what in systems that are both very dynamic and very much in evolution. So it's really interesting to hear those two perspectives in this seminar today.
Yeah, and it's interesting for me too. So I'm interested in this transition now as we switch to the Army Corps. So let me introduce our next speaker. Guillermo Mendoza he was trained as a civil engineer. He is the International Programs Manager for the Institute for Water Resources at the U.S. Army Corps. He's the lead author of the UNESCO publication Climate Risk Informed Decision Analysis, which is I just lost my screen. Which is a technical guidance for decision scaling in the planning of water resources. He collaborates with the U.S. Agency for International Development, the U.S. Department of State, the Millennium Challenge Corporation, and the Asian Institute of Technology. Guillermo, we are interested in what you have to say.
Hi, thank you for having me. This is very nice. Nice break from my usual work. The first question I want to ask everybody, just get a sense of the audience. Are you all, is this an engineering class, economics class, just to, you know?
This is very interdisciplinary. Students are from a broad variety of backgrounds. Spatial planning, somebody is studying linguistics, economics. So, you know, a part of the notion, besides comparing and contrasting the US and the Netherlands, is that this is such an all-encompassing issue, and it overlaps a lot of different departments and future careers.
Okay, brilliant. So please, it's something that's very technical, you don't understand, please stop me. I'm a mutt, so I'm an American grown from Peruvian roots in New York City. So if I speak too fast, also slow me down. So Hans went through a history of the Rijkswaterstaat and really kind of took a look at the kind of programs that the types of programs have evolved in the Netherlands. I'm going to do the same thing. I didn't start from the 90s, but I'm going to take you through a journey, a very similar journey, really on the analytics, you know, how we do the analysis for projects. Okay, so it's less program specific and more analytical. And I'm going to take you through a journey from deterministic to risk analysis. And so I'm going to explain what that means for those who may not know. So on the bottom right, you see these two little functions, these distribution curves, right? And
Guillermo, I think you need to share a screen if you're showing us some images.
Oh, can you see my screen at all? Do you see a screen or no?
I see you, but you haven't clicked on share screen yet.
I have not. It says my computer says I'm sharing my screen.
I can see a screen. I see a screen.
Oh, you do? Then it's only me who doesn't see it.
Yeah, I see a screen too.
Okay,
good.
All right.
Oh, now I do. Sorry about that.
Okay, so the bottom right little square shows two plans, you know, plan A and plan B. And the distribution curve around them shows the uncertainty. The y-axis shows, you know, the likelihood, the frequency of a benefit achieved. The x-axis is the actual benefit. So a deterministic approach would say, oh, look, the plan B is better. It has, on average, more likely you're going to get more benefits than plan A, right? So that's a deterministic approach. You have an answer. You give somebody an answer. A risk-informed analysis gives you the whole breadth of risk. So if you look at it in terms of the uncertainty, and that's those curves there, it will say, well, maybe plan A is better. I get less benefits, but they are more reliable, you know. But however, maybe, you know, I'm willing to take the risk on plan B. So risk analysis requires a little bit more thought about where failure is and the reliability of benefits. Okay, so that's all I'm going to say. Does that make sense to everybody? Right on. So I want to take you to a history from moving from deterministic to risk and why, and the things that led us there. So, but first, a little background. So the Corps of Engineers, we're pretty old for a U.S. institution. We really came out of the Revolutionary War, and you know, when we kicked out the British from our country, the only engineers were Army engineers, and George Washington, you know, wanted to make sure that the U.S. would grow, so kind of really established the Corps of Engineers as a place where national engineering could be done, largely around transportation, you know, like canals and stuff like that. And through time, the mission has grown, and it has grown really around evolving national interests, you know, and quote unquote, the constituents, the public, right? But one reason it's evolved. The other one, very similar to the Dutch, is responding to natural disasters. Like, you know, things go wrong, and we take back and take a look. How can we fix it? There's the chief planner from North Atlantic Division, Joe Vitry, has a similar saying to the Dutch. You know, never let a disaster go to waste. And another piece I want to mention too is how does the mission change? And I want you to remember these things from the federal government, right? There are two ways that the Corps' mission changes. One is by law. Congress legislates and tells us what to do, right? And they set budgets. The other one is, of course, is administration priorities, or the president. And even though the president, you know, we are part of the executive branch, and they can, the president will order a certain priority, right? So the priorities affect how we do things. Okay, so as I tell you the story, remember that piece. So real quick, our mission areas. We have our first real mission was navigation in 1824, and that took a while. Actually, that went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court had a big case because the argument was whether the federal government had a right to manage interstate commerce, right? And basically said, yeah, the federal government has a role in interstate commerce, right? That came out of, you know, it went through the law. It was challenged. Then soon thereafter, you know, we had we'll talk about this again, but we had a pretty dreadful flood in the early 1900s, which led to the Flood Control Act, and our new mission became flood control. We don't use that word anymore, but it was flood control. We could control floods. Now we call it flood risk management. And then 1980, even though we were doing environmental stuff, before that, ecosystem restoration became a priority mission after the Water Resources Development Act in 1986. Okay, and also watershed planning became a mission of ours. So these are the core missions, and also emergency response in coordination with FEMA and other agencies. Okay, so those 5 items are really our priority programs, or priority missions. But we have a whole bunch of other programs which are also important and well-funded, that are usually in conjunction with priority mission. These are recreation, hydropower, water supply, regulatory. You know, we provide permit. We give permits to people to do things in rivers, and environmental stewardship. Okay, so we are a very big agency with a lot of different people responsible for different things. Okay, that's just let you the culture. So you know, there are 25,000 employees, the Corps of Engineers, and we it's divided in divisions. So a division is loosely attached to a water basin, and each division has districts, right? And they really operate very, very, very independently. Okay, so headquarters gives guidance. The district engineers, planners, economists, social, you know, the chiefs, they have a lot of leeway on making the plans and projects. Of course, by the time it gets to the president's desk for signature and Congress, it goes through headquarters, right? So even though there's a lot of leeway at the district level, every planner in the Corps is very well aware of the requirements up above. Okay, that's how we work. We're much more complicated than the Rijkswaterstaat. And also think about it. For for if you're a planner doing a project somewhere, let's say in the Everglades, your plan will take about 3 years to do, right? And then you got to hope it goes to Congress, and you know how Congress is nowadays. Okay, so this is a reality of getting programs and projects passed through in the United States. Just to get you an idea of a base funding, our base funding really changes from 5 billion to 6 billion. This is the base funding of the Corps of Engineers. But what I really want you to peel your eyes on is on the bottom row. By far, typically, most of our money is sucked up by operation and management. Okay, except in flood risk management, because we get disasters, right? So in recent years, mostly major rehab has been a chunk, but the big problem we have is our money usually does not move beyond 6 billion. So usually something has to shove. You have more construction, that means less O&M. Okay, that's the reality of the Corps of Engineers, and this is what keeps districts awake at night. Okay, the fact that they have to play around with this money. And when money is given to you by Congress, it is appropriated, and you have to use it for that purpose. You cannot use it for any other purpose. And it is funded project by project because of Congress. Congress goes out and gives you money for project by project, usually not systems. There are exceptions. All right, and this is another piece of, I think it's important to let you know our funding by business line. But as you can see here, in general, our funding has gone down through the years. We're no longer a construction agency. So we are more an agency trying to maintain things, by and large, except when we get disasters. And those green things are supplementals. Those are not our base funding. Those are supplementals given to us by Congress, usually in response to a disaster. Okay. So all those green areas, really, if you think about it, often are what allows us to do things differently. Right? But that's a lot of money to let folks, okay, let's step back, because if you look at the bottom money, you have less money. The folks in districts are barely keeping up. They are, really, really good at making things work and getting it going, but they have very little space to go beyond and be innovative. It is because of the green stuff that gives them money to be innovative. Okay. This is unimportant for many of you, but this lays out some of the major legislation and executive orders that I'll talk about these again. Right now, the big thing that we are working on this year from President Biden is climate change, resilience, and the second one is equity, racial equity and support for underserved communities. This is a big deal, and I'll explain to it later. But part of the problem we have in the United States is that all our projects are approved. At the end of the day, OMB approves them. Congress gets approved in Congress. Looking at benefit cost ratios, right? Benefits must exceed costs. But not only that, but there's got to be so just looking at that benefit cost ratio component, right? If you look at benefits from flood risk program, benefits are avoided losses, right? And avoided losses usually are highest where you have more assets. And more assets occur where you have rich people, right? The assets from the poor are not very high, right? So there's not a very strong incentive to the benefit cost ratios in poor communities are low, right? If you do that, that's the nature. That's the problem with benefit cost. It's efficient, but it's not equitable. Second, in the Corps of Engineers, it's a good thing that we have a cost share program. So right now we have a cost share for any project, typically for the studies and for the construction and design. It's a 50-50 cost share with a sponsor or stakeholder. On the one hand, it's great because we are a highly collaborative organization now. We engage our districts, engage stakeholders Monday through Friday, 9 to 5. They know the stakeholders. They have stakeholder meetings. They collaborate. They have barbecues with them, right? However, to afford to be a sponsor means you have to have some money, right? So if you are a poor state, a poor community, you have a harder time playing. You have a hard time being a stronger sponsor program. So these are things. How do you get away with that? And of course, climate change is also a problem, and I'll go to that in a minute. But these are kind of challenges we are now facing, and that's been asked for by President Biden. All right, I think Katrina, obviously, Rita and Sandy were led to huge implications to the core, which led to a lot of the nature-based solutions that we're seeing now in North Atlantic, right? We start rethinking about creating buying down risk in as many ways as possible and relocation type strategies. All right. I'm gonna stop there. Okay. So the risk revolution. So I'm gonna quickly go through 1930 to 1970, right? So essentially, engineers, are pretty good people, but they're very guidebook people like me. We like our handbooks, our standards, right? And for the most part of the course history, Army course history, we have lived on deterministic approaches. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is you make a design, your optimal design, and then by statute, by guidance, you add, in the Corps of Engineers, you add 3 feet to a levee, right? So you make your design says your best design is 10 feet, add 3 feet, because there's a certainty, right? It's a set number, and you put it on there, and you're taking care of any uncertainty. And as an engineer, you say, I did my due diligence, okay? That is a deterministic approach. It is very convenient. It is very replicable, right? Easy to do, but very inflexible, right? And also, the issue was too, it could be very expensive. Like, is it worth the money you're spending? And also, in terms of community, it gives a sense that you did your due diligence, I am safe, right? There's no examination of risk. How safe are you really, right? And of course, the other things came along later on, related to the room with river, in terms of when you build a levee, 2 things happen, right? You transfer risk somewhere else, and you transform the risk, right? Transferring is you put some levees, and that flood water that you control gets moved somewhere else, right? You're moving the risk somewhere else, and the second piece, the transformation risk, is the minute you build a levee, right behind the levee, you have a whole bunch of city grow, right? People are safe, let's build there, right? So the deterministic approaches did not really convey uncertainty, right? And they discouraged it. Like, I've done my job, and almost rarely was there an accounting for possible probability of loss of life. The stuff that Hans was mentioning, how the Dutch are moving to the 1 to 100,000. Let's make that a critical threshold that we're willing to accept. None of that is considered, nor there was any discussion with the public on what is a level of tolerable risk. How much risk are you going to take? Right. That was something that was left to the engineers. It doesn't mean it was not considered. I mean, many people were thinking about it. By 1960s, many core folks were saying there's a problem here, right? But there was resistance because the Corps wants to deliver a project, and doing more work means that there are delays. And remember, it takes 3 years to do a project, and you hope if Congress do something else. So do you really want to work hard for a project that's not going to get funded, right? So you want to be very clear. You do not want to confuse Congress. You do not want to confuse OMB, right? But the early proponents of risk type analysis with hydrologists and planners, largely looking at droughts, and they were saying, we need a way to think about risk and droughts. But it wasn't until dam and levee safety issues and reduced funding, many things happened. One was there was a problem with dam and levee safety in the U.S. I'll talk about in a minute. Less and less funds in the government. So these challenges became an opportunity. Another thing that happened by the 70s is that we started getting better at understanding structural, levee structure, dam structure. So the engineering behind that got much better. We became much better hydraulic engineers, and hydrology. The science became much better. And also the social scientists and economists became much better, and there was more data, and we started getting really good at quantifying damage and loss of life. So these are three things that start happening in the 70s that let us think about things differently. Like, we have this new data, other things, why are we using it in a better way? So in the 1970s, things started going wrong. In 1972, there are two major dam failures, one in West Virginia, 125 people dead. Another one in Canyon Lake Dam in Rapid City, South Dakota, 238 dead. They were private dams. They were not federal or state dams. Well, one was a private dam, one was a waterworks dam, a municipal type thing. But people got worried. Well, I forget the president time, 1982. Legislation was asked to inspect all non-federal dams. Like, let's put some money. Congress said we need to understand the safety of all the dams. However, this is rejected by Office of Management Budget, and the only thing it's allowed to do is make an inventory of what they are. Nothing really happens, but people get worried. In 1976, we have another failure, Teton Dam. Even though not too many people died, 11 people, the big problem was that it was a federal dam, and the federal dams were not supposed to fail. They were dams that had all the standards, had the stamp of government, and this is the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, not the Corps of Engineers, but the Corps also had dams. Like, wait a minute, what about our dams, right? And the other thing that happened too was the failure was not a result of structural issues. It was a result of geotechnical, the foundation, the piping started happening to the soils, and the whole thing collapsed in a way that was totally not expected. These small pipes started growing, and the whole thing collapsed really fast. And it became really apparent that this whole field of science that was not well understood, and this really scared everybody. So Teton Dam really scares everybody a lot. In 1977, another dam failure. It was a private dam, but that really made the news because 39 dead, but these dead were mostly students. And when young people die, it was a dam right outside of college. So basically, it flooded a college. Okay, so this led to a lot of public perception, public awareness and public anger. I mean, the level of anger of Kelly Barnes Dam was really high because people don't like seeing the young people die. So this gave President Carter an opportunity, right? So he said, okay, now let's update the non-federal dam inventory and inspect 9,000 structures. And also FEMA got created this time. The government said, okay, we need an agency to deal with disasters. Well, what came out of it was that about 3,000 dams were listed as being unsafe. This is a massive challenge because, oh my goodness, this is a big task. How are we going to do this? So then Reagan came along in the 1980s, and Reagan, he was really interested in risk, and not so much because he was an engineer or mathematician, but because I guess his advisors let him know that risk was a way of reducing costs of projects. If you understood risk, you could make cheaper projects, and Reagan was all about cutting the federal budget. So this seemed like, okay, politically, this sounds really cool to me. So he appointed William Gianelli as Assistant Secretary of the Army of Civil Works. Basically, he's the guy who presents the Army Corps budget to Congress. And the value he brought was that he had actually developed the risk-informed dam safety inspection program of California. And the state of California had created a dam safety program because of 1928, another catastrophic damage failure of St. Francis Dam in Los Angeles. That's a top right photograph. This major dam failed in California. So basically, Mr. Gianelli asked IWR, where I work, to develop an approach to evaluating dam safety. Another thing that happened during this time was, and this is getting at the issue of equity and stuff, the principal standards that guided the engineering practice were replaced by the principal guidelines. The reason it's important is because this is the first time that the planners are asked to characterize risk and uncertainty. right? That'd be the first time. Until then, guidance said, just give an answer, put a safety margin, you're done. On the other hand, and the other thing that happened on the principal guidelines was a higher focus on efficiency, basically discounted benefit and costs, right? Less multi-objective. So this was a downside of the new approach. Basically, the main criteria for decision making was benefit and costs, right? Because once again, Reagan had the interest of reducing costs, reducing the federal budget. IWR does develop a risk framework. It became it was the first real study that Army Corps did, but it just collects dust. Okay, it's a report that sits in a library, collects dust. However, it exists, and the districts are required to characterize risk and uncertainty, but in a way that say this is the answer. The levee should be 2 feet high with 3 feet freeboard, and these are the risks and uncertainty associated, and that's it. It's a qualitative statement. Okay. More disasters come along on the horizon. 1978. I mean, they're not necessarily floods, but in 1978, the Love Canal. A major waterway gets polluted by industry in a way that was unthinkable. The 3 Mile Island nuclear power plant accident in 1979. Mount St. Helens, erupts, and the U.S. realized, oh my goodness, we are subject to significant things. The Challenger also fails, and all these, and of course we had the record floods in Mississippi, right? And once again, President Clinton asked for revised inventory, and now remember before President Carter had looked at dams. Now Clinton said, oh, we got to look at levees too. Now, but the big thing by the time we're here was the notions of tolerable risk began to emerge. We can't be safe. We cannot be totally safe. So what is an acceptable level of risk? And these are kind of questions that start coming at the Army Corps headquarters. Part of it, the 3 Mile Island nuclear power plant, it was a horrible thing. It was you do not want a nuclear power plant to have an accident, right? But people, folks from the nuclear committee in the U.S. were saying, well, look, it's a horrible accident, but more people die from car accidents. It's very rare. So they realized that there's a big issue on thinking about public perception of risk and how to discuss low probability, high consequence events, right? So these are things that are happening in the 70s. The other thing that happened in the 70s too, in 70s, 80s was that computers start becoming available, right? So things that you couldn't do before, you can start doing now, right? Not everyone had a computer, but certainly desktops were around. 1986 was another big milestone for Corps of Engineers, and it was the first major water legislation in 1971. And what happened here was cost share. The main things happened here. One thing happened was cost shares were required. This is the idea that sponsors had to pay usually a 50-50 to any project or study. And because they had to invest, the sponsor expected to know what the cost and benefits were. Not only that, but they wanted to know what the risks were. The states, local government had other questions that were really important to them. And so maybe it was unintentional, but this is what it led to. It led to people asking for, explain to me uncertainty, explain to me the variation of benefits, right? The other thing that happened too that was important was ecosystem restoration became a project purpose, right? So, and that provides that provides an opportunity to things like the working with the Netherlands on a nature-based solution, right? So you start getting these things being able to be integrated. So a new generation of projects started coming up the pipeline. Sponsors could have their own ideas, so they're bringing on into a project. In the past, the projects were proposed by an engineer in the Corps of Engineers. Now the projects, because they're shared, you share ideas, right? So they have other ideas. The stakeholders have their own ideas on what should be done. The other thing that happened was there was a lot of major rehabilitation. The country by 1986, because of disasters, we realized, you know, it was a wake-up call that our infrastructure is aging, and we had to rehabilitate it. So we needed methods to prioritize. You know, we're a huge nation. We can't fix everything. So what do we fix first? What is highest at risk? We need to make, you know, that meant probability. We need to understand the economic impact. So the IWR once again started developing software to help risk-informed benefit cost calculation, to help, you know, what do we prioritize first in the rehabilitation. The other thing that happened too that was kind of important was the WERDA 1986 led the establishment of the Inland Waterways Trust Fund, which really means it's basically a trust fund that any ship that comes to dock in a ship that comes to dock or use our waterways have to pay a fee, a tax. It's called Inland Waterways Trust Fund, IWTF. And that money goes straight to Treasury to be used in rehabilitation infrastructure and studies, right? So all of a sudden you have a whole bunch of money paid for by people using the commerce, you know, it's like a toll, and to do these things. So we're able to fund these other things that we want to do. However, freeboard is still a problem, right? This is what I mentioned earlier, this deterministic thing. It's very easy to do. And remember, like I said before, the planners are really trying to get projects done in 3 years time, and they're hoping they'll get funded one day by Congress. So they're you know, this is what, you know, so the three foot attitude design to justify each is still used by and large. And just to give you an idea of the rule of thumb they would use, to justify each foot, they will assume an additional 1/2 of the benefits from the main structure, right? So the whole guidance was really kind of wonky. It made little sense. It's this strange approach to do things, but it worked, I guess, you know. But it did not. It worked in the sense that it created a project that's very expensive, I guess, very robust, but it did not accurately add up benefit and costs, and it did not create incentives to explore risk and uncertainty, right? You know, you're overbuilding everything significantly. So risk-informed method really started getting a lot of legway, and IWR produced a guidelines for risk and uncertainty in 1992. However, there's still cultural resistance. It is viewed as an academic exercise, right? You know, many engineers and districts felt that the planning guidance, all it asked for was acknowledging risk, and the idea worked. They planned things that for the most part didn't fail, and they did not want delays. Okay. But at the same time, technology was catching up, so it was getting easier to do things. IWR developed HEC1 that allowed for anybody in the Corps of Engineers to do Monte Carlo analysis on their computers. For those who are not engineers, Monte Carlo analysis is simply comes from the casino. The math comes from the Monte Carlo casino, but basically it is the idea that you run a model once, you change a parameter, you run it again. You run it many times to get many answers, and from there we develop a probability distribution curve, right? And the people who came up with this were people who were trying to break the casinos and win money at Monte Carlo. So mathematicians. So that's where it comes from. But one thing that came up from doing Monte Carlo simulations and doing risk-informed analysis was that the net benefits as a system increased. You got better projects if you did a risk analysis. In the meantime, the Bureau of Reclamation, you know, after the Teton Dam collapse, they had created a whole bunch of experts. Their budget were cut, and because the budget was cut, they really embraced risk, and the culture of risk by 1990s was full part of the culture at the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation. The good news is that U.S. Army Corps of Engineers would learn from U.S. Bureau of Reclamation. Okay, so even though we're making progress, the Bureau of Reclamation was already a U.S. leader in this topic. Katrina comes along, and Katrina is a bad thing. Obviously, it's a horrible thing as a disaster, but also the failure was staggering, right? The 50 levee and flow failure. I mean, large part of New Orleans was underwater, several deaths, and you know, the communities in New Orleans felt that they were protected, right? It was a shock. The level of failure came to a real shock to the communities, right? So post Katrina, basically the idea of system failure became commonplace, and it became dawned on the Corps of Engineers that we had to look not at the risk of the project, at risk of the system. And so a huge amount of money was provided to look at a whole system of risks at Southern Louisiana at a scale and complexity that had never been attempted before. And this was historic. I mean, the level of analysis needed. They wanted to look at risk, to allow, because remember, it wasn't just a city that flooded here. Southern Louisiana is also where we have a lot of oil. Our oil, our strategic oil reserves are there, right? And we have big oil industry there, right? So navigation industries, and so the many things that affect the national interest. So post-Katrina funding and the a new Water Resource Development Act 2007 allowed the Corps to re-emphasize probabilistic methods and tools. It also accelerated how the Corps communicated to the public about risk. We started creating a center for risk communication, right? So the Risk Management Center, established in 2008, not only looks at the technical aspect of risk, but also at how you communicate it with stakeholders. Like, what does the 100-year term period mean, right? It's highly inappropriate. We're still evolving and adapting. I mean, we're still on this journey. Very recently, Hans brought this up, this international guidelines on natural nature-based features for flood risk management, right? This is a huge thing for us. On the one hand, it provides a guide for engineers and planners to buy down risk in a systems approach. It is multi-purpose on looking at multi-objectives in the planning process, and really requires moving away from stovepipe solutions to some kind of stakeholder engagement, collaborative processes. Climate change is also a big concern for ours, and we have this we have several guidance. In a way, the Corps of Engineers from the federal government side, we're considered a leader on climate change guidance. However, it has problems, right? To me, when I read our climate change guidance, it still reads like a deterministic approach. You still have to choose a future projection. You pick them, you plan for it without a certain probability. And when you do that, when you do the economics around it, you are biased towards the least remote solution. So in a strange way, even though climate change is about deeper uncertainty about future risk, our guidance seems to be more deterministic, right? So we still, and it's hard to move the culture away from risk-informed analysis. This at the far right is CRIDA, this book that was I guess funded by IWR and the Rijkswaterstaat. Another thing we developed, but it's really only endorsed by UNESCO HP. It's a cool idea. There's still resistance from headquarters to implement this at the Corps, or even do a version of it. Only just, this came out several years ago. Only just has headquarters asked me to test and pilot in districts. So change is hard, change is slow, but it happens. So headquarters of the Corps of Engineers understands it's difficult to change. And very recently, I helped lead a scenario planning exercise. Really I think the Corps understands it's hard to predict where we need to be and how to be ready for that. So we held some workshops with folks at headquarters and came up with 5 scenarios about the future and how to prepare the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Agency. The first one, this is linked to a lot of what I talked about. It's kind of interesting, I guess. One is that we're finding the politics changing more rapidly than we ever had before. So we're having new agendas every 4 years versus every 8 years, and more radically different. So if the Corps of Engineers reacts to executive orders or legislation, will that make us more susceptible to running around trying to without a focus? Another issue we have that's also a problem is an aging workforce, and we're having a hard time hiring, sustaining qualified workforce. As these futures come forward, will we have the teeth to meet these things? Climate change, disasters may overcome us, capability to keep up. The peanut butter crust scenario is one where most of our disasters are happening on the coast, and will we become a coastal agency and forget about the inland part of the country? Anyways, I'm done, and these are the questions we came up with that you asked me and Hans. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Guillermo. That was nicely you balanced your presentations in that you both gave this nice historic overview showing the evolution of thinking. I have a lot of questions, but I am not going to ask one question of either of you because I would like the students to ask them. Students, begin typing questions in the chat, and I would ask one of you to pose a question now in real time. I'm looking at Ryan, Sophie, Casey. Go ahead, somebody.
Yeah, I actually had a question about the risk communication program, and I was wondering if there was a lot of political pushback to that.
Good question. No, I don't think there really is. I think there's a lot of interest across the board because I think everyone's seen, the success it's had.
Go ahead, people chime in there.
But I could be wrong, huh? So this is my impression from.
Yeah, the big question is, if I may add, that
Yeah.
do our politicians understand risk?
Yeah.
We actually never. I think we never. Well, that's a bit of the Dutch system. We are not allowed as civil servants to talk with our parliament. So that's our Congress. So it's all quite formal. There is a movement to change that a little bit, but so there is this uncertainty also within Rijkswaterstaat. We propose things, but do the politicians understand what we intend to do?
Yeah, but some things are pretty easy though. I mean, I'll give you an example, right? So the one in 100-year return period, right? Is the storm that any year could happen 1 out of 100 times, right? It's kind of hard to imagine, right? That statistic, that simple statistic can be reframed as saying, look, there's a 16% chance that over the next 30 years, 16% over the next 30 years, your house will be flooded with an event of that magnitude. It's the same statistic. Now, but now I would imagine you're more worried, and so is a politician, right? 16%? Yeah, 16%.
Yeah. In the time you live in that house.
Yeah.
It's your property. Yeah.
Other questions? Hannah, Andre, Sana.
I had one question. When looking and listening to you guys speak, I kind of thought about it in perspective to the United States and a bit internationally speaking. Would you think that putting in place such organizations that kind of maintain risk at such a high pace and kind of coordinate with the government, do you think that's a good solution to start off in the United States if we're trying to see what moving towards such a kind of a Dutch polder model? What do you think?
I guess that's a question Guillermo has to answer.
Could you repeat it again?
I was just asking if putting in place such organizations in the United States would be a good step forward before institutionalizing a whole kind of polder model.
I mean, what types of organizations are you thinking?
The organizations such as the RWS and just kind of the flood management ones.
I mean, we have them in the States, right? So we have these organizations, the Army Corps of Engineers, and after Katrina happened, right after, I mean, the day after, our current Director of Civil Works, Mr. Lee, he was in charge of Louisiana from the Corps side, and he was trying to talk about ideas that are applied in the Netherlands. And he told me how valuable it was when the Rijkswaterstaat team came and said, we do the Netherlands and it works. And all of a sudden, people, for some reason, I guess, the idea of having the Rijkswaterstaat provide input, right, was very useful for that. In that way, if that's what you're getting at, bringing in experiences for other organizations, it's very useful to us, and it helps build credibility on our own engineers. Did I answer your question, Morris?
Yeah, thank you.
Ryan, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I was sort of wondering, I guess, how we could sort of create a common sort of point of view in terms of like everyone sort of being a part of the same issue, because in the United States, sort of with all the different climates and how large it is, the ways which climate change will reach and affect different areas will happen completely differently and in different times. And so I was sort of wondering what your guys' answer was to that.
Well, I think we both ended with this handbook on natural nature-based features, which was we didn't, that was not something we agreed on. But I think it illustrates that if you have the time and the budget to work together, suddenly issues become surprisingly similar. A beach in our country is a beach in the US. You might have more extreme, like with a hurricane. We don't have hurricanes, so the impacts may be higher, but the beach is still a beach, and you can do the math about it. The same is for rivers. Mississippi and the River Rhine, yeah, different in size, but if you look at the kind of measures you could take, and the way you talk about risk, that's surprisingly similar. So actually, yeah, I think the answer also provided by Guillermo in since we started cooperating beyond what we did previously, only navigation. So since I think the first MOU we signed was memorandum of understanding we signed was 2004, and then Katrina happened, and yeah, Guillermo just told us that it was because there was this sort of on paper agreement to work together. It was quite easy to get in touch and share ideas, work together. So I think we didn't tell the other what to do, but I think we mutually inspired each other.
Yeah. I also want to add to that question about the differences. So I think that's why it's also very important to do a proper risk assessment, right? Everyone has different risk. The way floods happen in California are very different than the way the floods happen in New Orleans, right? Fundamentally, right? As atmospheric river is a hurricane for the most part, and even then it's very different. Let me give you an example too, a real life example of a real stakeholder problem. In Miami, the Corps of Engineers came up with a proposal to address kind of the high wind hurricane, but the stakeholders are really interested in the slow hurricane. And the design is totally different on how to address it. One is keep the water out, right, and the slow one is get the water out, right? It's fundamentally different engineering structures, and so my point being is that doing a proper risk analysis helps in understanding where your failure points are, and how. And in climate change, there may be combination of things, not just temperature or rainfall. It's usually temperature and demographic change or a certain climatic variable, and they all differ wherever you live. And understanding how you break is important. What is your how do you lead to failure, and that's very local.
Sophie?
Yeah, it was interesting to listen to both of the lectures and talk and hear how you both spoke about the position that stakeholders have in water systems. And it seems like the Dutch system has more of a collaborative sort of atmosphere for stakeholders to come together, and the US stakeholders. You talked about, Mr. Mendoza, about how they might need more economic means to have a say. So how can the US make it more inclusive for stakeholders who don't have the same economic means to gain a position?
That's a really good, tough question. I could answer, but I'll be making it up. I don't know.
I have an idea. In the Netherlands, it's easy. Yeah, we live below sea level, so a small country. So actually, we just have, a natural dune system. We have to, of course, we have to maintain that. And where there's no dune system, we have levees, so to keep the seawater out. And then along our rivers, like in the America, we have levees. I think our standards are a bit higher, but that's mainly due that there are relatively more people living behind it, so the risk is higher. What we've seen in England, actually, that's a bit of a mix between what we have and what there's in the US. So they have a scheme where, depending on, I would say, the financial capabilities of a community. So if you have a low sort of a low local funding, so limited funding, you have a higher percentage of what you can get from a national fund. If you are a rich community, for the same project, you would need to use more of your own money compared to what you get from, say, a national fund. So that's maybe a solution out of it. The fun thing is that actually the Army Corps asked us, I think a year ago, what we do with communities which have little funding, and actually our answer is that's something we don't have, because everybody is protected just because of the way our country is like it is. So it's not really an issue in our country, but I guess if you'd like to solve it, you have to do something about this sort of 50-50 share of local versus federal.
Yeah. So in honesty, so two things have to happen, right? One is the 50-50. The sponsorship has to be different for wherever you live. But of course, you can imagine in Congress, people will start calling that communism, right? Right. And then and then the second piece that has to happen is the updated Water Resources Development Act. The new PNG that Reagan signed, had a focus mostly on the principal decision criteria is national economic development, which is the federal interest. We need to have a president one day sign an updated version where regional economic development is also an objective, right? So if a project should also be counted for, the value it has on regional development, which doesn't, as from the federal side, it does not. But those things are beyond what I can do as a federal government employee, right? Those are things that if any of you guys are going to work in politics or if that's what you plan to do, that'd be an area of great frustration, but potentially, you'll feel good about it.
That's something that a lot of the Wake Forest students have commented on. So much of this has to do with problems with the overarching political system and divide in the US. Let's go to Tessa next, because you had your question in the chat.
Thank you. I was just wondering, I had a question for Hans Pietersen. You discussed how throughout the history of managing water risk in the Netherlands or by Rijkswaterstaat, the Netherlands or Rijkswaterstaat has tried to be inclusive, mainly by including perspectives in the organization based on lines of central, regional, or local voices, and for this reason, I was wondering how Rijkswaterstaat tries to include marginalized groups today. So I looked really quickly, and I found, for example, that in 2019, only 6.8% of all Rijkswaterstaat personnel had what in the Netherlands is called migration background, and often those people work in lower positions as well. And in comparison, I know from my educational background in international relations that about 25% of Dutch citizens have a migration background. And do you know if Rijkswaterstaat takes active steps to be more inclusive towards different kind of people?
Yes, well, to start with your last question, yes, we do. But the reality is, well, actually, in my team, we had a vacancy. In the first round, which actually we failed to find a suitable candidate. It was well, sort of a very senior position. We had 14 candidates. None of them actually was from a, I would say, a different cultural background. They were all, say, white Dutch, if you would call it that way. The second round, we had 35 applicants. Actually, yeah, it's for me not possible yet to say how many of are there from a different cultural background, but actually there was one colleague who gave me a call, and that's the reality. She already worked in within Rijkswaterstaat. She was from Suriname Hinduistic background, and this the function was actually would focus on our collaboration with China. So we also have a collaboration there, and she gave it a lot of thought. But her personal experience from previous work in Africa is that, yeah, people usually, because I have a dark skin, they don't tell me, but they approach me differently. And she was very worried that in this work, that would be something would hamper her work in China. So actually, she chose not to apply for this function, although I think she would have done perfectly. So yeah, the reality is that we are very open, but people either don't, yeah, apply for the function, or they are maybe a bit too afraid or feel that they might become in a difficult position internationally. So. But yeah, with that respect, to become a more inclusive organization, I think, although on paper everything is right, there is probably a lot to learn from the United States.
Jack, go ahead.
Does it answer a little bit?
Go ahead, Jack.
My question is also for Hans. For large projects such as Make Room for the River that involve many local agencies, how do you balance allowing each local authority to implement their portion of the project and providing that autonomy, while also keeping all the leaders on the same page at the same time?
Well, the big solution there is to make sure that your project is well funded upfront. So this whole project, yeah, if you are experienced, you can give a sort of estimate what a big project like that would sort of cost. And I think our organization, Rijkswaterstaat, does a pretty good job in, bringing that up to Parliament and say, okay, yeah, we in this particular case, I think we need 2.4 billion. So that was decided somewhere in 2000. That's probably what we will need, that order of magnitude for the whole project. And we were, in 2008, when the project could formally start, we were sure that we would get that amount of funding. You could compare that a little bit to what happened after Katrina in the United States. It was fully funded by Congress upfront. And that gives you a lot of freedom as an organization to organize the work. So that's one. Make sure that you have a good starting point. The other one was, yeah, we had our standards, so we knew what to. So we had our design sort of I would say design of this river system. So we knew sort of the performance criteria. So we said, okay, these are the performance criteria. This is the budget split by 35, looking a bit about what we could do there and there. So everybody knew more or less the budget, what they had to work with, but it was not sort of how do you say that? It was not stapled down. It was sort of, okay, you get sort of 350 million for that project, more or less. These are the kind of standards. These are the kind of options. But you know, make sure that you sort it out. And there was some pressure because Parliament also asked us to, you know, make sure that, well, at that time they said, well, if you start in 2008, you better get everything ready in 2015. So there was a bit of time pressure. So essentially what Rijkswaterstaat did, we didn't have a lot of people working on the project. We actually, the only thing what we did is make sure that we, you could say, were the oil in the machine. So we made sure that we picked up the issues. We helped it smooth out. You know, the top management of the project. There's a quote. Well, I have to be a bit careful there, but he had quite a big restaurant bill. Like if you would say, so, you know, you have to use all your charms to get something done. Make sure that you listen to the stakeholders, make their concerns, take it seriously. And the end of the line, because it also meant in this whole project that there were quite a significant number of people who had to move their house or their farm. Make sure that they are compensated seriously, not a real compensation. So not you get a lot of money. No, you can relocate your farm, and we can help you in that whole process. And what we learned there is that people, you know, at first there's resistance, but then if the reality hits in, yeah, they like to have it done as fast as they could, because the worst thing you can do to your citizens is let them wait for many years in uncertainty. So these were I would say the way we operated there. Don't know if that answers your question, but that's how it was done.
Yeah, I think that the easy answer is there's no easy answer, but you did
no,
a good
the easy
job.
answer is there's no easy answer, but you have to be on top of it. So I don't know if they really used that particular spreadsheet I showed you, but at least they did something similar. They took everything seriously. They made sure that they understood it, that they had the options there, and may also make sure that if you make because a project usually has many sort of decision rounds and actions you have to take in between before you're there. So make sure that every time you decide, you make sure that this is a decision, so that it's not something where people in a later stage come back to. Make sure that you are able to move step by step ahead.
Let me, I realize we're past time here, and we've had several people have dropped, but for those who are still here, if Hans and Guillermo, you're able to hang in for another minute or two, let's try to get, Tracy, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, this is more towards Guillermo. I was wondering, since assuming that you had worked still with the RWS and Army Corps throughout the past two, the current and the last presidential administration, if there were any differences you noticed in terms of regards towards climate change between the two, the most current two presidents.
Yeah, so funny thing, I actually did a detail at the White House during the Trump administration, so I got to see very closely. You know, I was an advisor of water. So yeah, absolutely. Under the Trump administration, there was climate change was not a priority, right? It also, it was not a priority. However, resilience was still considered. So resilience under the Trump administration was part of the national security strategy. So if you're interested in looking at the policy, There's you can look up national security strategy under President Trump. It's on page 7, and it talks about resilience to natural hazards and other unconventional stressors. So, folks, even though there was no funding for climate change work under the Trump administration, folks used that language to justify working for it. And they weren't calling it climate change, but they were calling it resilience to natural hazards and unconventional stressors. So work did happen, kind of guerrilla style. President Biden, so he has several executive orders. He brought back an executive order from President Obama on flood risk management and bringing climate change into flood risk management studies. So he brought that back again, and so definitely it's being a big change in emphasis. So obviously the Army Corps, with the Rijkswaterstaat, we're thinking about being more carbon neutral to mitigate. But we're also, the idea of green infrastructure is gotten a lot of interest from the Biden administration. So it's another reason why that's important to us. So yeah, the change administration has shifted and prioritized those thinking. But it never stopped, though. My point was it never stopped under Trump, because it was just kind of put under this other, category.
Let's see if we can get in these last 2 questions here. I appreciate it, those who are hanging in there. Maddie?
Hi, kind of a question similar to Tracy's, but with the risk revolution in the 1960s, when there had to be like an institutional and cultural changes that the Army Corps was like suggesting, how would you say that those changes differ like from the ones that should happen today, especially with like all the developments with climate change that have happened in the past few years?
So you talking about cultural change, or the
both cultural and institutional.
Yeah, okay, so great question. Sorry, it's me. I think some of the challenges are, we have institutionally speaking, we have so many requirements that without climate change, the planners are exhausted. They are overwhelmed, right? So while the districts see, firsthand the impacts of droughts and floods and pumping, how about saltwater intrusion, they're seeing the impacts. However, they are so institutionally there's the level of, in a way, micromanagement or due diligence that the Corps has hampers the ability for folks on the ground to think outside the box. So that's a big problem. Yeah, that's the first. Second, on the cultural side, I think the culture of the Corps of Engineers is to deliver a project in 3 years within $3 million, and get and hopefully it'll get approved. So unless we provide very clear guidance on how to deal with climate change to the planners, economists, and social scientists, it is not going to happen, because you need to provide some, even if that guidance gives a lot of flexibility, there is none. So nobody's going to be willing to take a risk. That culturally speaking, there's very little reward for failure, right? So when you plan for climate change, there's a problem that you will be wrong or delay the project, right? So nobody wants to do that. So that's a problem.
And Tara, the last question.
Hi, yeah. I was just kind of wondering how, because like America, like US citizens it's really hard to unite them, especially cross-party divides. And we've seen that like in the pandemic and other recent years. And so I was just wondering if there's a way like you could combat like the backlash that you would get from some of the population for enacting any change, or if there's just no way to avoid that.
Well, so from the Corps perspective, the public is not too divided, right? So often projects do not cross, the nation, right? They cross they're within a county or a basin, right? And within the basins, whether you are a Democrat or Republican around water, typically your concerns are similar, right? And I think districts have been able to build a relationship. The only politics that really, there are certain things that divide the country, but I think there's more that unite the country at the project level. Sorry.
I muted myself because my dog was barking. That's an interesting, hopeful note to end on, Guillermo. Thank you for that. Thanks everybody for staying longer, those of you who are able to. Guillermo and Hans, thank you very much for taking time out of your valuable schedules. This was, I think, really useful for all of these students in both countries to get an overview or two overviews from the high level at which you both sit. So we much appreciate it. And this is our last joint session, the students in Groningen and Wake Forest. So thank you to the students in Groningen. Wake Forest students, we will be in a smaller group next week. Terry, if you're still on, do you want to say a final word?
Yeah, and the American students will see me back in class 5 with a little more on institutional fragmentation and follow the money, because that was, I think, part of this two cultures, that the way money is handed down differs really fundamentally, which explains much of the effectiveness and the decision-making culture. I was interested, by the way, these are these risk-obsessed engineer organizations, and they have to start communicating, and communicating is, of course, very risky because it may blow up in your face. So I would like to hear more on some other occasion how an organization so much interested in engineering risks is dealing with communicative risks and all these political issues, and how to be kind of, divided mentally between those two worlds. But thanks so much, Hans and Guillermo, for this introduction into the nuts and bolts and the histories and the evolutions of your respective organizations.
All right, thanks everyone.